Coming up, we learn how the school-to-prison pipeline is affecting Native communities. Plus, an Indigenous musician talks about his life on the road with his kids. And a pioneer of contemporary Native journalism has died. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Arizona State University welcomes 3,500 Indigenous students from Arizona and across the nation. It serves one of the largest populations of Indigenous students among U.S. colleges and universities. We created a sense of place for tribal nations to create futures of their own making through community outreach and research, taught by world-class Indigenous faculty where they see a reflection of themselves and their experiences. Find community at ASU.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amirawa Hopa. Thank you for joining us. We begin in Massachusetts, where last week President Joe Biden announced his administration's climate strategies. Calling climate change a clear and present danger to the nation, Biden says he will address the climate emergency in the coming weeks. Environmental executive actions include initiatives to support the domestic offshore wind industry. In April, the administration announced an investment of $46 million to address the impacts of climate change in Native communities. Solar and wind projects are already underway in tribal lands, matching Biden's sense of urgency.
In the coming days, my administration will announce the executive actions we have developed to combat this emergency. We need to act. We just take a look around. Right now, 100 million Americans are under a heat alert. 100 million Americans. 90 communities across America set records for high temperatures just this year, including here in New England.
It is unclear if this announcement includes fossil fuel projects on or near Indigenous lands. The Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition says it's being left out of talks on a new hospital. The group says it has a complaint with where the $3 billion facility will be located. APTN's Fraser Needham has the latest.
Ottawa needs a new hospital. The existing Civic Hospital is close to 100 years old and it is crumbling. Council has signed off on a new site near what the locals call the experimental farm, a sprawling 400 hectares of green space and trees good for walking and cycling. Mickey Adams says she fell in love with the area when she moved to Ottawa from Rankin Inlet, Nunavut, 4 years ago.
And here in Ottawa, it's such a beautiful city, a lot of green space and so much to discover just within the city itself. So whether it's cycling or walking, we love to walk around and view what the city has to offer.
Adams is also co-chair of the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition. They're primarily against a proposed 4-story, 2,500 space parking garage. Hundreds of trees will have to be destroyed, but City Councillor Jan Harder is having no part of this argument. Here she is at a council meeting earlier this year.
So take your trees and your freaking parking lot and shove it where the sun doesn't shine.
Adams says comments like those make her wonder how serious Ottawa really is about reconciliation.
Just goes to show their part on wanting to take part in reconciliation and how they unfortunately view Indigenous people and our culture and our ways. With respects to shoving the trees up our blank.
The site is in New Democrat MPP Joel Harden's constituency. He says a number of groups are opposed to the new hospital as well. And an above-ground parking garage was not part of the original plan.
So we were told last May that this would be a 4-story airport-sized parking garage across the street from a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We were told that. The hospital had said previously it would be 1,100 spaces buried underground.
In an emailed statement, the City of Ottawa told APTN that every effort will be made to preserve as many trees as possible. And for every tree removed, another 5 will be replanted. Also in an emailed statement, the Ottawa Hospital told APTN extensive consultations have been done on the new hospital site. This includes with an organization called the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Council. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Another Indigenous athlete took home a medal from the World Championships. Crow Creek citizen Becca Howe was the first U.S. athlete to medal in the sport of petanque. The outdoor game is played by two opposing teams trying to throw balls as close as possible to a small wooden sphere. Howe brought home a silver medal with record-breaking points in the 2022 World Games last week. She powered her way to the finals in the precision shooting women's single competitions at the Games. Becca is a two-time national champion and a six-time regional champion, and she notched the highest number of points ever recorded in competition by a U.S. petanque athlete. Well, one of New Mexico's longest-running historical events is celebrating 100 years. The Gallup Intertribal Ceremonial will celebrate its centennial in Gallup, New Mexico on August 4th through the 14th. The event will include both in-person and virtual events. The 11-day celebration will have processions and performances, rodeo events, ceremonial queen and princess pageants, a 5K run, and more. The first intertribal ceremonial was held in September 1922. Gallup Intertribal Ceremonial Association President Kyle Tom says the event is a staple in the community and welcomes travelers from all over the world. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, we honor the legacy of Tim Giago, who was a fearless champion of Native people in journalism. But first, Scotty Clifford joins the show to talk about his family band. Stay with us. The School Prison Trust is a new addition to the Forerunners First Ideas series. From the University of Minnesota Press, these are short books of thought and process scholarship. One of the authors, Jeremiah Chin, joins us today. He is an assistant professor of law at St. Thomas University, where he teaches several classes, including civil procedure and federal Indian law. Hi, Professor Chin. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So first off, tell us about the impetus for this work.
So the impetus for this work is based on all of our different backgrounds and experiences among myself, Dr. Sabina Vaught, and Dr. Brian McKinley Jones-Brayboy. And all of us are approaching issues of the relationship between schools and prisons from our different expertise and backgrounds in law, education, and history.
I guess at a high level, tell us about this school-to-prison pipeline for Native children. What can you tell us?
Well, our work situates this pipeline, which is where children are pushed from schools and into incarceration, in the context of history. This is not a new process, but rather part of the long colonial history of the United States and how it treats and handles youth, particularly Indigenous youth in the United States.
And at the center of this book is a young man, Jakes. Tell us about his story.
So Jakes is a young man who Dr. Vaught met in one of her interviews in a youth prison, a prison school, in fact. And so his story was the impetus for the book because he opened all of these different windows of different ways of thinking about the school to prison relationship, both historically and contextually and in the modern times. And so part of the book is also considering and listening to those youth who are being affected by this prison system, and how do we use their stories and consider their stories in reframing the conversation.
Has information and research ever been done on this before?
There has been research on the school to prison pipeline for Indigenous youth. I think what our book is doing is joining the conversation and putting it in context with the history of the treatment of Indigenous youth in the United States, but also with the modern context of the school to prison pipeline work that is being done by scholars throughout the United States.
Absolutely. I think on a national scale, we see research done on this about people of color in general, but to see information about this for Indigenous youth is something that you don't come across very often.
Yes, unfortunately, we have a really big problem in the way that Indigenous youth are being treated by these statistical studies, right? The Indigenous youth are not considered as a statistically significant sample population. And so we wanted to ground this in storytelling so we avoid those statistical uncertainties, but also contextualize some of that statistical research with stories of youth and stories of history and peoples and place.
Absolutely. I mean, what other kinds of stories stand out to you from this book?
So the stories of Jake's are the framework for the book, but we also connect this to stories of history and stories of modern shifts, both for incarceration and against incarceration. And these are stories of law too. So the stories of federal Indian law, which is where my legal expertise comes in, is a part of that history, but also a part of the present day. And we saw that in the most recent term at the Supreme Court, and the effects that this has, not just on nations, but on peoples and youth who are, taken from their homes and put into these prisons and schools and prison schools.
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing so much in the news right now about boarding schools. Can you maybe talk about how historical trauma sort of informs the current day trauma that happens?
Well, I think there's historical trauma both in the individual and personal aspect, but also the trauma and the systems are very much mirroring the process that we've seen in the past. The boarding schools were not an isolated phenomenon, but are very much remanifesting in the way that the mass incarceration system treats youth, particularly Black and Indigenous youth in the United States, are a further manifestation of this system. And that's where we approach it from the book.
We only have about a minute left here, but I want to get to, what's next for you all in this research? What can we expect?
Well, I think it's, as I was saying earlier, it's about joining and continuing the conversation of the school to prison pipeline research, but then expanding that to consider colonization, conquest, to consider an invitation to dialogue among different communities on how we can not only look at the history of incarceration, but also the present problems of mass incarceration, of schooling, and consider something new and different by using the stories of people like Jake's as a portal or a window to something more, an invitation to a deeper conversation.
Well, Professor Chin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lakota and Cheyenne citizen Scotty Clifford is a rock and roll artist from the Badlands of South Dakota. His band Scotty Clifford and Spirits Cry includes his son Welby June and daughter Wapeluela. He joins the show to talk about music and the adventure of raising Native kids on the road. Welcome to the show, Scotty.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let's just jump right in here. What made you want to become a musician?
Probably just like watching MTV when I was like 3 or 4 years old, and just feeling like that was the thing I needed to do with my life.
And you've been doing this now for some time. I mean, we talk a lot about, raising your kids on the road. Tell us about your favorite parts of that.
Probably just, how they say quantity versus quantity. I feel like all of it is quality time, but it's also, most of the time, post or pre-pandemic, and just now starting to get back into it, so yeah.
I think so often when we travel, we get to learn about the world in a different way. What do you think that teaches your children and also yourself?
I think for me, the whole concept of movement and the Lakota culture is a very sacred one. So as long as you're moving, you're truly growing and learning, and that's the only true form of change according to a lot of our elders. So just moving forward and keeping that, idea of just the experience of continuing to move forward.
I think that idea of movement and, bringing your core values into your music is something that we hear very often. What other kinds of ways are you using Lakota lifeways in your music and in your life?
Well, I would say how the Lakota, as well as other Northern Plains natives, like followed the buffalo. I would say that for me, following the music is kind of an ode to my ancestry, whether it's being Oglala Lakota or Northern Cheyenne. So basically, we just follow the music, and that's how I teach my children our own form of, economy. Just kind of living like how we used to live off the land. It's basically living off the music.
Your album, Stars Fall, was released in 2019, and then, of course, the pandemic hit. How did that impact the music and the touring?
Yeah, well, we were talking with some people out of Austin to do like a record deal, and we put out the EP Stars Fall in 2019 and just started to get some momentum, and then everything just went kaput, right? Everything stopped. So just now it feels like there was this huge pause, or we woke up from this huge long nap and we're ready to go again. But just got to make some adjustments and hit the ground running when we can.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, give us some examples of what you have next coming up. What kinds of exciting projects are you working on?
I would say I will be recording in the fall at Hen House Studios in Venice Beach with Harlan Steinberger. And that's going to be great. That's where Willie Nelson, Nora Jones, a lot of people have recorded just recently. And as far as gigs, we have the 48's powwow next week in North Dakota, which is Standing Rock Reservation. And also we'll be coming down to Swaya in the Indian Market in Santa Fe, performing at Buffalo Thunder Friday night, part of the Native Guitars tour. And then the next day, the Pathways Festival, which is also in Pewaukee. And after that, we go to, I think we come back up and we do some shows in Rapid City. Then we go out to the West Coast in the fall.
Well, all of those events sound so exciting. I know I've recently got to go to some Native conferences, and it's just so wonderful to be back out in the community. Maybe talk about, what you're looking forward to most in terms of getting to see all of the Indigenous folks who come watch you play.
I actually forgot to mention that we're going to be in Kayenta, is that how you pronounce it, Arizona, for a voter registration event that's being put on by Allie Young and the other great people out there. And that's kind of like an all-day event. We'll be one of the featured acts for the live music toward the end of the day, and that's August 13th. So being in the Four Corners area, just seeing people, meeting new people is going to be really great. And slowly, things have been opening up. It's not quite back to normal for the music industry just yet, but we're getting there. But more than anything, we're just really happy to see other Natives and really, really get to be a part of the community once again.
Well, Scotty, Clifford, thank you so much.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Well, we join you now with some news about ICT's founder. Over the weekend, Tim Giago died at the age of 88. He founded the Lakota Times, which later became Indian Country Today and now ICT. Giago was a fearless champion for the Lakota people and for Native journalists. For decades, he wrote stories, founded and published newspapers, and worked tirelessly to make sure Indigenous people have a voice in the media. ICT's Vice President of Broadcasting, Shirley Snavy, interviewed him a year ago. Let's watch.
In 4 decades, it's safe to say Tim Giago has covered all the angles. So when I asked him about the stories he enjoyed, he didn't disappoint.
My goodness, there's been so many of them for 40 years. I think it's always exciting when we first started out to cover our first tribal elections. That was way back in the 80s, and it's our first try ever at covering a political campaign for some of the candidates, and so it kind of gave us a feel of how to handle elections from then on, and I think that was a good thing, because elections are so important, during on the tribal elections.
He brought attention to Indian country stories that needed to be told, and he did it because he knew journalism and freedom of the press is a constitutional right.
I think a newspaper has a responsibility, if it's a minority paper, to also be an advocate for its readers. And There was a time in the 1980s when we had heard rumors that the banks in the border towns like Chadron and Rushville and Martin were charging higher interest rates to Native Americans. So we did a story on it, and the Justice Department came out after reading the story, and they fined all the banks and stopped what they call redlining. So that was a good thing that we did. Back in 1989, I did an interview with Governor George Mickelson, and he was kind of bothered by the relations that the state and the tribal governments had. And I asked him, I said, well, what is your hardest part of your job as governor? He said, I'll tell you the same thing my father told me when he was governor 40 years ago, tribal relations, Indians and whites. He said, I'm going to try to do something to improve on that. And it just so happened, it was 1989, and the coming year would be the 100th anniversary of the massacre at Wounded Knee. So I thought that would be a good catalyst to maybe start getting things done. Maybe the legislator would be open to it. So we came up with the idea of a year of reconciliation for 1990 and doing away with Columbus Day and replacing it with Native American Day. And we did all this just by discussion and by writing. You know, we didn't protest, use any violence or anything else, but it got done. So we now have Native American Day. I think we're still the only state in the Union that celebrates Native American Day as a holiday.
One of the things that separates Giago from the pack is his willingness to bring up painful issues like boarding schools to really make his readers think. He was a student at Holy Rosary and wrote often about that experience, starting in the early years of the newspaper.
Well, I think it kind of started early, because one of the first things that we started to do was look at the boarding schools. We wrote about the boarding schools 40 years ago, and right now it's all over the place because of the bodies they're finding up in Kamloops in Canada. And we've said all along that go to any of the schools like St. Francis, Holy Rosary, and you're going to find graves up there of kids that are buried in unmarked graves. And I wrote about when Bozo Richards died. He was 16 years old. And they assigned me and Roch Red Elk to dig his grave. We're 14 or 15 years old, and we're up there digging a grave for one of our friends. And while I was in the grave swinging my pick, I hit something and I pulled it up, and it was a little skull stuck on the end of my pick. So we dug into a child's grave. So those are the things that people try to keep quiet. I think the schools, the boarding schools, did so much damage to the Indian children, and we tried to talk about those things. We interviewed a lot of the students that were badly abused at these schools, and some of them totally ruined their lives. A lot of them ended up in prison. Some of them committed murders. Others became alcoholics and drug addicts. So we saw generations of children, maybe 3 generations, that were impacted by the boarding schools. And no one was covering that except us back then.
Giago mentored many writers, artists, and reporters, and along the way they won hundreds of awards for journalism.
I remember one day I was at work, and this big old heavyset guy walked in and introduced himself and said, I'm Paiute from Nevada. He said, and I really like your paper, and I'd like to go to work for you. And his name was Adrian Lewis. And so Adrian came in, and one of the really great writers, did great stories. In fact, I often talk about a column he did where he was observing sheets hanging on the clothesline outside of his window at his apartment. And he did a whole story on sheets that related to a lot of things that we never think about. That's how good a writer he was. He eventually became my managing editor, and he passed away. And one of the guys now that's being considered for a Pulitzer, Marty Tubles, he came into my office in 1988, him and his wife, and I hired them both. Put her in the business office, and I put him in the production department, assembling ads. And one day I did an editorial, and I took it to him. I said, see if you can do a cartoon to this, because he had a good hand in art. So he did a cartoon for the editorial, And from then on, every week I'd give him my editorial and he'd do the cartoons for it. So he got his start doing cartoons. So he was another one. And Tom Littlemoon was another great artist that we had. And I wish that we could assemble all the cartoons he did for us over the years and put them into a book. But he passed away also. But I have some really people I'm proud of that worked for me at the early days when you really needed good minds.
At the 2019 conference of the Native American Journalists Association, an organization he helped found, Tim was able to meet some of the next generation of Indian Country Today, nearly 40 years after he founded the paper. Tim celebrated his 87th birthday recently, and he says he's finally ready to retire. He wants to write another book for the next chapter of his life. His legacy will live on through the many folks he mentored. In Rapid City, South Dakota, Shirley Snavy, Indian Country Today.
ICT sends our condolences and many prayers to all of Tim Giago's relatives. And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand, just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
The ICT Newscast is produced by Indig Public Media. This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.